The average number of readers of an article by a philosopher is 1.43. And I figure my mom was one for me, so there's like 0.43 left who read anything that I wrote. And I wrote for probably 5 or 6 years, I wrote on liberty and tolerance. And I wrote articles that no one read. And as I approached age 50, I began to think that philosophers should be more engaged with what's happening out there in the world. And I decided that I wanted the work that I was doing on tolerance to actually make a difference. And so I decided to work on a book. The book is Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in Age of Religious Conflict, and you can buy copies out there if you like. But I found out that this was read by about 1.43 people. And also it was written at a fairly high level. I'm going to read part of it to you, which I think is not at a high level. It's going to show why doing this kind of work is important around the world. But Jimmy Carter, for example, wrote for this book. And the first democratically elected president of Indonesia wrote for it, Abdurrahman Wahid. And a lot of other great people wrote for it, but hardly anybody read it. And maybe you noticed it has not yet achieved world peace. So it seems like there's a lot more work to do. And probably the most poignant essay in here is an essay written by Nurit Peled El-Hanan. She's Jewish. She lives in Israel. I asked the 5 Jewish authors, I asked the 5 Muslim authors, and I asked the 5 Christian authors to write in favor of liberty and tolerance and compassion and peace. I asked them to write from their own faith perspectives. There's a lot of work on liberty and tolerance that's written from Western, white, liberal Enlightenment and to big parts of the world, colonial powers. There isn't much written on the topic that's written from the perspective of people's religious beliefs. And I think people's religious beliefs in the Abrahamic tradition have a lot to say about why we should support tolerance and encourage liberty and exercise compassion around the world. So I asked people to write from their own perspectives, and Mike actually thought that was a good idea too, and the Templeton Foundation funded this book. Thank you, Mike. And if you haven't heard any of it read before, I'll read a little bit of it to you.
1.43.
Yeah. This is why what we do is important. On a Tuesday afternoon, January 16, 2007, an Israeli soldier shot 9-year-old Abir Aramin in the head as she was buying a lollipop after school in Anada, a neighborhood north of Jerusalem. She was killed by a rubber bullet that was allegedly fired from the rifle of a member of the Israeli border police who was allegedly sitting in an armored jeep, allegedly thrust the barrel of his rifle through the opening that was allegedly designed for that purpose, and allegedly aimed and fired at the head of the girl who was standing beside her sister at a kiosk, allegedly buying candy. The Army did not conduct an inquiry into Abir's death. The official investigation was defined by the High Court of Justice as a travesty. No one was questioned except for Abir's sister, 11-year-old Irene, who held her sister's hand as she fell. According to the Israeli Defense Force, the shooting never happened. Their official account of Abir's death states that she might have been hit by a stone thrown at our forces by one of her classmates. A senior pathologist who examined her body at the family's request contradicted this account. Stones thrown by 10-year-olds do not blow brains out. Moreover, Israeli jeeps routinely circle Palestinian children on their way to and from school in Anada, greeting them with stun bombs, rubber bullets, and riot control gas. I saw Abir at the Hadassah hospital, where she slept quietly in a huge hospital bed. Her face was white, her eyes were closed. By then, she was already brain dead, and the doctors decided to allow the rest of her to die as well. I could see that she had not been shot from behind, but the doctors at Hadassah would not disclose the cause of her death. And in case you think that I have something here particularly to say to Jews or that there's a political point to this, I actually asked Nurit to write about it because her daughter had been killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber. That's why I asked her to write, and this is what she wrote instead. Abir Aramin entered into the Holy Land's ever-growing underground kingdom of dead children. She will be welcomed by my own little girl, Smadari, who was killed at age 13 in 1997 by a suicide bomber. There's killing on all sides. There's hatred on all sides. There's intolerance on all sides. And Nurit's essay, I love Nurit. She works for peace. Her husband, Rami, works for peace. Her husband, Rami, was at the bedside of that little girl as she died. And he's best friends with the Arab-Palestinian father of the girl that died. And they work together for peace. I recommended there's a documentary about Rami and Bassem, and a really powerful documentary about their friendship, about their bonding over the death of their children, about how they work together for peace. So I figured after the 1.343 people bought the book that we needed to write a book that communicates to people younger and better and more effectively. So I got the idea to put together this book and have just one Muslim and one Christian and one Jew write for the book. And I asked again that each author would speak from their own faith perspectives, and that we would aim at, say, a book a 10th grader could read, an 11th grader, maybe a college student. And it would be something addressed to people in the Twitter generation, so they would be short, 3 to 5 pages long. I also began to realize, and I hate this, as a philosopher, I hate this. My wife's been telling me this for years, but people aren't that persuaded by arguments. And people don't really like to be argued with. And so that my stock and trade is argument. I love to argue. I love to write arguments out. But I know that they don't change people's minds, and they don't change people's hearts, and they don't change people's lives. And so I asked, for every chapter, I ask each of my co-authors to tell stories. They have to make a theological point, something that's in favor of liberty and tolerance, but they have to make that point with stories or with narrative. And that's what they did. I think it's a really beautiful, powerful book. I think you'll like the stories. I'm going to let my co-authors tell their stories. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me. I was raised in a very conservative Protestant background. That's how I was raised. And so conservative was my background, I was raised that only Protestants of a certain sort were going to end up in heaven. People that believe pretty much roughly like me, but not, say, Baptists or Arminians, like they weren't going to get into heaven, not them, for God's sake. And then, but Catholics, especially not Catholics, they weren't going to get into heaven. And I was already inclined not to like the Catholics because I grew up in southern Michigan, and I was a Michigan fan, didn't care that much for Notre Dame. So, I already had that going on. And so I didn't mind that much that I might miss out on the Catholics. But then in graduate school, I went to Notre Dame. I got my PhD at Notre Dame. And I began to look around and I began to think, well, maybe these Catholics aren't so bad. They all seem like decent human beings. Some of them seem, much further along the way of the path of sanctification than I was. And by the time I graduated, I had not yet gone to a Notre Dame football game. I resisted that for 5 years, but I could no longer think that all Catholics were going to hell. I just couldn't think it anymore. And by meeting people who were really different from me and talking to them, my view of God just got bigger and bigger. But then I thought, the Muslims, Catholics were really bad, but the Muslims were always the worst in the tradition that I was in. And then I met Muslims, and I couldn't think what I thought, 20 years ago when I was a kid. My view of God and the world and other people just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember my first trip into a Muslim-majority country was Turkey. Oh, it was the second time. The first time was with you and when I met Aziz. It was the second time. And we got into the home of a Muslim family. And they fixed dinner. I was with a group of about 16 people. Doug was with us. I think we had maybe a dozen people. So a family invited us into their home. It wasn't a big home. We were in their living room, and it was all filled with tables and us and some of them. And there was an imam that was there. I didn't know that, but all of a sudden somebody had to get up and he had to go do the call to prayer. So he got up and went to do the call to prayer, and then a little bit later we heard him do the call to prayer. People pointed that out. He was doing the call to prayer. And then one by one, the Muslims at the tables would get up and go somewhere. And I thought maybe they all had a little touch of something in the stomach or something. They all had to get up and go to the bathroom. Why? And why just the Muslims? What were they eating that we weren't eating? What was going on there? And I'm not one to just keep people's stomach problems to themselves, so they come back to the table, and I said, what the heck are you guys doing? Why are you getting up and going? Where are you going? And they didn't really want to talk about it, but they told me only after I insisted. They were all going off to pray. And all the Muslims here will know this. They had a room in their house with a prayer rug, and the prayer rug faced Mecca, and they went off one at a time to pray. They didn't make a big deal out of it. I don't know if anyone else even noticed that people were leaving to pray. They weren't trying to show off with their spirituality or their prayers. They just quietly got up and went out and prayed. And so I asked them, what did they pray? And I was told that they always prayed this: there is no God but you. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, praise be to Allah, Lord of the universe, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day for judgment. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we call on for help. Guide us along the straight path. So in a prostrate position with head touching the ground 5 times a day, Muslims pray to the one all-merciful God. There is no God but you. So this is what I write in the book. I grew up in the Protestant Christian tradition, which emphasizes divine grace and denounces works of righteousness. Rituals, we had been taught, were empty. We thought the attitude of our heart was more important than the position of our body. And grace alone demanded a trust in God's mercy we thought was absent from, say, Catholics and Muslims. I remember the first time I visited a Roman Catholic church. I found kneeling down strange and even spiritually offensive. Although I've come a long way from my fundamentalist Protestant anti-Catholic roots, I was emotionally prepared to dislike the Muslims' ritual prostration and ritual. But I didn't. My Muslim friends, I learned, were more concerned with a faithful heart than a prostrate body. And they likewise trusted more in God's abundant mercy than in their puny prayers. And I appreciated that ritually connecting to the all-merciful was a good thing. Finally, in their repeated recitations of "there is no God but you," I began to hear the radically unselfing and morally and spiritually fundamental truth: I am not God. And I began to think that just about everybody, from fundamentalist Christian to devout atheist, could profit from bowing down 5 times a day and to remind themselves that they are not God. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Nancy Kramer, who will read a bit from her, tell us about herself and read from her book.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for bringing me to Michigan. I haven't been in this state for probably 40 years, and it's just wonderful. It's a beautiful place. Walking here from the hotel across the river on the bridge was just a lovely experience, and I thank you all for such a warm welcome. I really want to see this country. I've been to a lot of countries in the world, and I've learned that our country has so many beautiful places I haven't seen, and it's exciting to check them off my list. So, you may be wondering why a rabbi spends so much time with people from other faiths. Well, I'll tell you. Thought this would be a good way to start. There are lots of chapters in here, but the one I want to share with you today is the one that actually Kelly encouraged me to write, because he asked me to, according to him, he said, one of your chapters has to be titled, "What I Have Learned from Christians and Muslims." So it was in that chapter that I chose to get a bit autobiographical. And here's what I shared. So for me, it all started in 1974 when I was a college senior. So I'll give you a minute now, you can do the math and figure out how old I am. I saw a flyer about a conference at New York's Church of St. John the Divine. I put on my backpack and took a bus down from Connecticut to a gathering. The gathering was called Auschwitz, Beginning of a New Era, ? Remember, this is 1974, right? Not this time. That conference changed my life. It set a course for me for the next few decades. I had already known that I wanted to go to rabbinical school. But what I learned at that conference was that there were faithful Christians who were grappling with the role of their church in the Nazi Holocaust. And I wanted to hang out with these people. I was moved by what they were doing. So a few years later, I moved to Philadelphia and began my studies at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which providentially was located 6 blocks from Temple University, which had a very great department of Jewish-Christian relations. So for 5 years, I spent time running back and forth between those 6 blocks, between those 2 worlds. And ironically, in the rabbinical school, I was doing my academic work. I was learning Hebrew and Aramaic and history of Jews and all that kind of stuff. And in the other place, at my academic PhD, I was doing my spiritual work. The historical critical work at the seminary, all about that scholarship, was, for me, nowhere near as compelling as what I was learning with those Christian scholars who were really deeply, deeply, passionately committed to figuring out what went wrong with my tradition and what can I do to set it right. So these guys were on a mission. It wasn't the old style mission of conversion, but it was a new mission. In the history of 2,000 years of the church, it was a new mission. Like their counterpart, Christer Stendahl, the Swedish bishop who was teaching at Harvard Divinity School, they were trying to figure out, can I sing the song to God without telling dirty stories about other people? This was more than just a decision to want Jews and Christians to get along better. They really saw this, that there was a family dynamic here. And like in every family, or in many families that I know, things can go awry, and they need to be fixed. They need to be worked out. So this turned out to involve not just being nice to Jews, but to really rethink what's Christianity all about, to rewrite liturgy, to reconstruct theology, to rewrite, like my teacher, Gerard Sloyan, and the other person who did that with him, Leonard Swidler, they rewrote the Oberammergau Passion Play, and they went to Oberammergau in Germany, and they said, the way you're doing this play is not okay. Here's a better script, why don't you do that? And this is a town that's been doing a Passion Play for 600 years. And they said, well, they did make some of the changes. So what I learned was that our religions evolve in relationship to one another. And the faithful don't like to say that. They like to say, this is what Jesus always taught, this is where it came down from Moses on Sinai. But those of us who do the historical work know that actually we're constantly reinventing our religions and our faith traditions, and we're doing it because of interaction with others. And in the post-Holocaust journey to reconstruct Christianity, here's what my takeaway was. You can reconstruct your faith because of a connection to the other, because of what you learn about the other. Now, at that time, again, we're talking now when I was in rabbinical school and graduate school, it was the late 70s and right up until the 80s, although I didn't finish the footnotes of the dissertation until the 90s, but that's another story. I finished everything else in the early 80s. But then I had 2 kids, I got a little distracted. Anyway, in the 80s and 90s, this work was about helping Christians get their house in order. And that, to me, was important, interesting work, But after a while, I began to say, so what have I got to do with this? That's their problem. They should fix that. But I can cheerlead. I can write articles, journal articles that few people would read about how the anti-Semitism in Old Testament theology in the 70s or whatever it was that I published articles about. And I realized, though, that I was actually interested in something else. I was interested in my own tradition and how we could reconstruct our tradition in light of what we came to know about what was wrong with the world and what was wrong with our own traditions, actually. But I wasn't quite sure what that was all about. So in the 90s, I kind of hung out and did some other things, not important right now. But I remember I went to work for the Jewish Family and Children's Service, and I remember sitting in my office in Philadelphia, and it was a gorgeous, if you remember, well, certainly on the East Coast, it was a gorgeous September day, September 11th, 2001. And I remember people, talking in the hall and saying, airplanes have gone into the Twin Towers and the schools in Philadelphia are closing. You better go home because your kid may be coming home from school, which indeed she was, because we didn't know. We heard Washington was hit. We heard New York was hit. Well, maybe Philadelphia would be the next one. There was still a plane in the air over Pennsylvania, whatever. It was not a good day, but within days after that day, all of a sudden I said, oh, my career as an interfaith educator has just gotten a restart. I do know now what I need to do. I know something about interfaith work. And sure enough, within weeks, I started getting phone calls because I was still known in the world as someone who knew interfaith. And they said, we're having a dialogue, you must come, you'll be the rabbi. And I said, oh, I know how to do that. There'll be a priest, there'll be a minister, and there'll be me. And they were like, no, actually, since September 11th, we've suddenly woken up to the fact that there are Muslims in this country, and even in our city. And actually, the dialogue is going to be, well, the Christians are going to have to share one seat. They're going to have to figure out if there's going to be a priest or a minister, and that seat is going to be with an imam, and then there's going to be you. And I said, I'm all in. That's what I've been waiting for. That's what I want to do. That's what I'm interested in learning about. And then I thought, uh-oh, I don't actually know anything about Muslims. All I know is that they're in trouble right now, and I thought, I got a PhD in religion. I must know something about that religion, Islam. So I went back and I looked in my notes. This is before everything was in digital, and I actually got a folder out, and there was Islam 101, and I went through all the pages, and I went, oh yeah, I did take a course in this. I still don't know anything about Muslims in America today. Who are they? Are they black? Are they brown? Are they white? Where do they come from? What do they care about? How do they practice their faith today? I had taken a course about Islam, but I didn't know anything about what I was doing. So I began a steep learning curve. And I think any of you who've ever had a steep learning curve know how incredibly exciting that is. And I started it sort of beginning of 2002, and I have never stopped because it has been such an amazing, incredible experience to learn from my peers and to take my rabbinical students, because I was teaching rabbinical students at that time, to take them on this journey of learning who their Muslim peers were among emerging religious leaders in the 20th and then 21st century. So it was a very, I don't say a gift to me, that sounds like a silly way to put it, but for me, it has helped me learn so much about what needs to be fixed in my own tradition. And I'll be really honest with you here, because I know you're all good folks, and you know this to be true in your churches, and if you are the Jews here in your synagogues, we non-Muslims have a lot to learn and a lot to unlearn. And I see that in my communities everywhere I go. So for many years now, I've been going to synagogues and I've been talking to them about Muslims in their own communities and who are they. And people are curious, they are fearful, they are in some cases ignorant, in some cases compassionate, and sometimes it's the same person who's all of those things. because the line that runs through those actually runs through everybody's, not everyone, but many people's hearts as well. So I'm going to close up now and stop talking because I like hearing Aziz talk more than I like hearing myself talk. But some of what I just want to say that I have learned about being a religious person from hanging out with all these Muslims for so long has been really powerful. Learning about the physical ritual acts of getting down on your hands and knees that Kelly just talked about, saying ritually washing before prayer. Many of these things are things that I've taken into my own practice in ways that I say, oh, actually there was a Jewish practice about ritually washing hands, but I never did that because I was a liberal Jew and that was a traditional practice. But seeing it through other people, seeing other people do it sometimes allows you to reimagine the power of it, how embodied ritual, what it does for people. Another thing that I have learned a lot is talking to my Muslim friends about what it means to fast through Ramadan and some of the deep meanings that they have extracted from the experience of knowing what it means to fast. Now, Jews fast less often, actually. It's coming up on Tuesday night to Wednesday, but when I fast now, I have lots more meaning that I bring to it. And the final thing I'll talk about is Hajj. Something, again, where because I've spent so much time with Muslims, they've talked to me about the power and meaning of going to the sacred place, to Mecca, which they do once in a lifetime if they possibly can. And many of them have described to me what it meant to go there and to make that journey. And understanding journey as a spiritual discipline has brought a whole new meaning to me about what it means to travel to Israel, and also to travel to other places that have become for me ways of thinking about walking toward a deeper understanding of my life and of God. And since I'm talking about travel, it's a perfect segue into my co-author here, who knows more about travel than most of us, although we all wish we knew as much as he did.
Oh, come on. Thank you for this nice introduction. I actually thought maybe I'll tell a couple of stories from the new book, just so I don't bore you from the old stories. But I'll start with my beginnings, kind of similar to what Kelly said earlier. I also grew up in a community where I didn't know many Christians or many Jews, or any Christians or any Jews on a personal level. We've encountered each other. Normally it wasn't positive. My brother was killed when I was 10 years old, so I didn't get along with Israelis at all. And then I didn't have any Christians that lived in my neighborhood, so I didn't know any. Until when I was 18 years old and I went to study Hebrew. And in my Hebrew class, I was the only Palestinian studying there. And there were mostly Jewish students, and there were a couple of Christians who were studying there as well. And one of them came to me and asked me if I would like to go out with her. And I thought she was American, blonde girl, and I thought, oh, thank you, yes, absolutely. And that's, look at this, I'm doing so well already. Girls are inviting me out. So I agreed, and I thought I was going out on a date. She did tell me it's a concert where she was also singing, so I'm like, wow, she's like, this is gonna be really fun. It wasn't a date. I sat down in the audience and I figured out it wasn't a date when they started singing, and the first song was, I have decided to follow Jesus. It was a church service that she invited me to, but my English was so terrible and neither of us spoke good Hebrew, so I assumed it was a date. So, however, I was too embarrassed to leave, and so I thought I'd start by reading it from, you all wrote about what we learned, started with what we learned from the other religions, so I'll read about that. So, I was too embarrassed to leave, so I sat through the service, the first time I have ever been in a non-Muslim worship space. When the preacher started to speak, to my surprise, I was moved. The message, which was translated into Arabic, was, love your neighbor and love your enemy. This was the perfect message in Jerusalem. Christians, he said, should love Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis should love Palestinians, and Palestinians should love Israelis. Everyone should love everyone. And I totally agreed with him. The preacher also challenged and provoked me. He quoted from the prophet Isa, Jesus, "You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder." Then he called everyone to a higher level of faith, one beyond mere intellectual asset. Quoting Jesus again, he said, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that?" Yeah, IRS people, I think, do believe. "And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?" So that was my first ever real introduction to Christianity and to learn about how our faiths can come together. A few years later, I ended up studying in a Bible college, and I did that on purpose because I was so moved and I wanted to learn much more. At the same time, I ended up working in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish shop, so I was learning a lot about Judaism as I was doing that as well. And it was such an amazing experience to be able to do that. And yet we can sometimes live in a place and be so separated from the people around us, from other faiths, from other people who are around us. And we can assume that we know everything when we don't. So let me tell you a couple of stories. One is when I was in Ulpan again. So I told you my brother was killed when I was 10 years old. So I didn't have any interactions with Israelis. I was politically active, exactly on the other side. And then when I was 18, I realized I needed to learn Hebrew. Otherwise, I can't really study and work and do stuff in Jerusalem. You can't function without Hebrew in Jerusalem. So I went to study in an Ulpan, which is where mostly Jewish immigrants go to study Hebrew. I was the only Palestinian in the classroom. I was very uncomfortable when I got there. But I remember one day specifically, I was going from my house in East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem. It's about 20 minutes walk. I mean, it's really close. And as I was walking to there was a siren. And suddenly, I didn't understand why. Everyone just stood still. Cars stopped in the street. People got out of the car and everybody stood still. And I couldn't figure out what the heck is going on. And can you imagine yourself being in that situation? Like now, something happens, everyone stands and nobody would talk to you. And I was the only person who was moving. So I was convinced it's some kind of robot mind control, aliens attack on Earth, and I was the only person who's surviving the mind control, and it's gonna be up to me to save humanity. That wasn't the case, but I was convinced of that, and it's because how little I knew, even though I lived in Jerusalem. I didn't know that this siren is a Holocaust memorial, where every year there's a siren, and people, regardless what you do, will stand up and do a minute of silence for those who were killed in the Holocaust. And even though I lived in the same city, I knew nothing about it. And that's what I think amazing for all of us to think about, because we can talk about Muslims and Jews and Christians, but if we think about it even here locally, how little do we know our neighbors? And we can think we know so much when we don't. I saw it recently with my father, who just came for the first time ever from Jerusalem to visit the United States. And he arrived and said he wanted to go to the mosque. So I thought it would be nice if I sent him with somebody from the Muslim community leaders. I called a friend of mine. Her uncle is one of the community leaders in Washington, D.C. And so he took him to the mosque on Friday. And when my dad came back, I asked him how was his experience. And he said it was fascinating. I said, "Did you like the mosque?" And he said, "Yeah, but we didn't go to the mosque." So where did he take you? You didn't go to the mosque. He said, "Well, we went to the mosque, but the mosque was full. So we went across the street to pray." Like, "What's across the street? Another mosque?" And he said, "No, it's a synagogue." "Synagogue? You prayed in a synagogue?" He's like, "Yeah, you won't believe this. Muslims here rent synagogues to pray in." Which for somebody from Jerusalem, that is crazy, because it has never happened and it does not happen. And for him to go and pray in a synagogue was so exciting. that he just couldn't comprehend it. So he got back home and he started calling everyone in my family back in Jerusalem, my uncles, my cousins, my brothers, and he's like, he would start every conversation the same way. You know, it's Friday, guess where I prayed today? And they're like, very funny, you prayed at a mosque. And he'll say, no, I prayed in a synagogue. And they're like, did Aziz convert you to Judaism? No, but that's how little we interact with each other. You know how many synagogues there are in Jerusalem? Quite a few. And Jerusalem has 500,000 Jews, more or less, so there are quite a few synagogues. And yet my dad, 82 years old, has never been to a synagogue in his life. And that's what I try to do in my work. I come from conflict resolution background. I used to work at George Mason University, where I directed a conflict resolution program focusing on religion, diplomacy, and conflicts. And I worked in different conflict areas around the world. And what I found wherever I went is how little we communicate with each other and how little we're willing to learn sometimes about each other. And that can be even inter-community. I mean, there's a chapter here I talk about Shia and Sunnis, and I come from a Sunni family. And even when I was like 6, 7 years old, I remember watching a television show, a movie, and it was a movie about Iraq war with Iran. Now, I knew very little about politics back then, but somehow I knew I was Sunni, and therefore I supported Iraq. And my sister asked me what I was watching, and I told her, I'm watching this movie where the Iraqis are fighting the infidels. And she freaked out because she was like, 1, you shouldn't be watching this movie. 2, who are the infidels you're talking about? And so I explained to her, well, the Iraqis are speaking Arabic, the other guy speaking a weird language I don't understand, therefore the Arabic one speaking, are Muslims, and whoever not speaking Arabic is an infidel. And she sat me down and taught me that, well, 1, most Muslims don't speak Arabic. The vast majority of Muslims are not Arabic speakers, which was very confusing for me because I'm like, but the Quran is written in Arabic. And so poor girl, she had to spend quite a while with me. And then she explained to me the differences we have within Islam. Sunni, Shia, Sufis, Abadas, all kind of different groups. So even among ourselves, we have so many differences we have to learn. And then even among ourselves, there are different ways to deal with conflicts and conflict resolution. So I worked in Afghanistan, I worked in Syria, I worked in Colombia, and everywhere I've gone, I realized I cannot bring my own knowledge of how to deal with conflicts to a new area. I have to come and say, yes, I know some frameworks, I know how to do this, but I want to learn what works locally. How do you solve your own problems? And often it's connected to faith, it's connected to culture, they all come together. And I know this again from my own family. I'll tell you how my family solves conflict. This is a story I haven't, I think, told before in these talks. One day, we got a phone call from my brother, and he said, come to my house quickly, we caught a thief. And so we all run to his house, and when I say we all, we're a big family, so like dozens of people show up at his house. There's this young guy who he locked in a room, and everyone and my cousins wanted to beat up that guy to death. And my dad walks in, and he says, no. He takes his ID, reads his name, gives it back to him, and he says, you can go. And we all mad at my dad at this point. It's like, no, we have to show them they can't come and do this to us. And I say, it's fine. So what actually happened is this kid comes into the house, he gathers all the stuff he wanted to steal, and then he thought, wait a second, I think I have enough time. Maybe I'll smoke a joint. So he sat down and he smoked a joint. And then he thought, well, it's only midnight. If I take a nap, nobody's gonna find out. So he took a nap. The only problem, he didn't wake up until my brother found him in the house, and that's how we caught him. So my dad called his family and said, your son did 1, 2, 3. Let's settle this in our traditional way. And so they sent a delegation to meet with us. And they came in, we had a spokesperson for our family, they had a spokesperson for their family, and it was an incredible experience because we sit down, we serve them coffee, they don't drink the coffee, they put it down, and then it starts going about what happens now. And they say, we admit guilt, we admit that our son did something totally wrong. He slept in your house without permission, he stole things from you, unacceptable, what do you want? And we laid down a few demands, such as he should go get some rehab, some help, and they said, yeah, absolutely. They said he can't come into our neighborhood for a while because if one of my cousins sees him, there might be, young people problem. And they said, yeah, absolutely. And then we said, there's also financial compensation. I said, absolutely. And the bigger the crime is, the bigger the amount should be. So we started with a modest amount of $1 million. Now they knew and we knew that nobody's going to pay $1 million. But it was on purpose to show how big this crime is. And so they said, absolutely, that sounds very reasonable. But for the sake of God, we know you are people of faith. Would you, for the sake of God, give us a discount? It's very Middle Eastern. I mean, you haggle at everything. And so my family go, yeah, for God, we can definitely do that. From $1 million, we go to $500,000. We're very easy, apparently. And then they go, well, for the sake of Prophet Jesus. And I say, okay, for Jesus, we'll go half of that again. And they say, how about for Moses? And we go, half again. They go, Muhammad, and we go, half again. And it goes down until eventually it gets to $20,000. And then we say, that's it. 20 is fair. And they say, okay, fine, give us a few days to collect. Why they need a few days to collect? Because not only the person who commits the offense, a crime, will pay it, it's the whole family. Cousins, second cousins, everyone will pitch in, which makes a big difference. Understanding conflicts locally makes a big difference. And so everybody collects their money. 3 days later, they bring us the money. Me and my brother sitting down and thinking about how we're going to spend $20,000. This sounds amazing thing. And then my dad goes, oh, you shouldn't do that because we're giving back the money. You what? He said, we're giving back the money. Like, so why did you take the money in the first place if you're going to give it back? And so he explained his reasoning. And his reasoning was, one, he wanted them to collect the money so they can feel the pain of the crime. If he forgave them right away, they would never understand the consequences of what happens. And he said, by all of them giving us money, and by me keeping the money for a few days, they'll definitely feel what it means to lose it. And then when you give it back to them, they're even more grateful that you are coming back and saying, here is your money back. So, but why forgive them at all? It is our right to take that money. It is acceptable. Nobody looks down at you for taking it. He said, well, we are a big family. The chances are one of your nephews are going to do something stupid at some point. I have 21 nephews and nieces. So it's like the chances are one of them going to do something stupid at some point. If we are known as people who forgive, maybe when we commit a crime, a sin against somebody, they'll remember us as people who forgive. But if we don't, people will remember us as those who don't forgive. And to me, that was very instrumental in what I learned about conflicts, communication. All of the work I'm doing is understanding how local conflict resolution works, how bringing people together work, and understanding how culture makes a big difference. And if you come in not knowing how everybody else thinks, how the other people you're communicating with, how do they view conflicts, how do they view life, how they view solving problems, how do they communicate with each other, then the likelihood is you're not going to be able to get along. But if you step out and say, I'm going to come in not with my presuppositions, not with my own understanding, but I'm coming in totally willing to understand how you do it, then it does make a big difference. And I think what we try to do in this book is each one of us outline where we come from, where our culture comes from, what are the issues we're struggling through, and try to communicate that to you, but also with each other. And so there's a dialogue that's going, here's how my culture deals with it, how does your culture deal with it, and then coming together and saying, okay, now we can talk to each other, now we can understand how we can build on this. Thank you.
Aziz, if you want to find out more about him, read the cover article of last month, the August Smithsonian Magazine. The cover article is on his tours, and his tours bring people on opposite sides together. They do it in conflict zones around the world, Israel and Palestine most significantly, but read it and find out. And here's an interesting thing. I guess there's two interesting things we've all found out. A lot of us find out, I take academics often to usually to the Middle East, Muslim majority countries. I'm trying to get peace and compassion and liberty and tolerance on the agenda of professors, graduate students. And often I'll bring professors from the United States to, say, Turkey, and we'll go visit a mosque, and it will be the first time they've ever been in a mosque. They might live 2 blocks from a mosque. They might live down the street from a Muslim. But I got to take them to Turkey to meet a Muslim. And you know what? There are Muslims here, and there are some Jews here, and there are lots of Christians here. And we all think everything should happen locally. And we also think this. We wrote this book. We hope you buy it and read our stories. By the way, you can buy it for $10. Our cost. We're not making any money on it. We're not out for profit. We're out to get the ideas out and around the world, and we'll stick around after. And you can have any of us you would like sign autographs. But we think people really change mostly when they actually meet other people. And you take a second and hear other people's stories. And our book is full of other people's stories, each other's. We've learned an enormous amount from each other. But people don't change, I think, unless they meet other people. I'd like us to do one thing. We're gonna have a question period. But before they have that, I'd like us to do one thing. I'd like you to have you think sort of roughly what your religious background is. I don't care what you are now, but like if you're an atheist now, but your background was Christian, put yourself in the Christian category. And if you're an agnostic now or a really conservative Muslim, put yourself in the Muslim category. And if you're Jewish or at your background, I don't care what you believe now, put yourself in the Jewish category. And I want to see how many of you have a Christian background. Hands up. Everyone look around, especially if you're not of that background, look around. Okay, how many Muslim? Okay, look around, take a look. And how many Jewish folks do we have here? Okay, look around. All right, what I want you to do now is just quickly, some of you will have to move. I want you to talk to somebody who's not of your background for a second. Introduce yourself for a second. I want you to think up a question, okay? You're going to jointly think up questions. Some of you may have to move to do this. We have 3 unclaimed Jews in the front row. First question. Yeah.
So as you mentioned that in passing, that your brother was shot, but that's something that stays with you. Does it come up often for you?
Does it come up? Yeah,
So
I mean,
come up as in like with interactions, is there any anger?
I usually talk about it a lot, actually. Today I didn't, but usually I talk about it a lot because I'm the youngest of 7. I'm what you call the oops child, kind of wasn't planned for. And Taysir, who's older than me, was the person who was killed, and he was the one just older than me, 9 years older. So he was in charge of my life, basically. My parents were like, we've raised enough kids, you take care of him. And so my first day in school, he was the person who took me to school. If I had any issues in school and whatever, he was the person that really supported me in everything. So when he was killed, it was a big change for me, and it was more like losing a parent than losing a brother. And that's why I said for the 8 years after, I didn't do any pro-peace or whatever. I was very much on the other side. I became very active politically. I was protesting all the time. I edited a youth magazine for the Fatah Youth, which is a political group. This was my only direction. And it took me years later to realize choosing to be angry and choosing to be bitter and to seek revenge made me being a slave to the person who killed my brother, because those were not my choices. Those were his choices. And if he decided to kill, that doesn't mean I have to decide to do the same thing. And it took a lot to come to that conclusion, but that was very redeeming for me.
Thank you, Jim.
If you want to hear more about it, read the book. This is the end of the first chapter, and he writes about, he's only 10, I think, when your brother passed away. And this is how he ends the first chapter. The dismal life of a Palestinian boy, displaced, disenfranchised, and distressed, is fertile ground for the radicalization of justifiably angry young men. While it is often appropriate to punish wicked deeds, my parents repeatedly remind me of the higher and more beautiful path, the path of forgiveness, Quran 42:40. They were constantly worried that I would seek revenge and end up being killed. They encouraged me to avoid politics. Believers are repeatedly encouraged to be forgiving and compassionate people who, according to the Quran, control their rage and pardon other people. My parents would say this repeatedly, but I was not yet in a position to hear. And the rest of the chapters are his path to peace. Did you have a?
Yes, I did. We were having a discussion. So I'm interested in learning more about the things that, or my impression, were normally the things that cause conflict, which would be the underlying beliefs in each religion. So, for example, I believe in salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And I also believe in loving God and loving others. And I love this. This is fantastic. But how do you handle the underlying differences of each religion when you were in this interfaith? What I perceive is the thing that does cause the conflict. How do you handle that?
I don't know if we all have the same thing. We started talking about it earlier and then we had to start, so we stopped. But I'll tell you my thoughts. One is, I like to talk about those things. I think it's good. I went to a Bible college. I went to an evangelical, very conservative Bible college where salvation and so on, those were main topics in it. And I liked to be there because I wanted to learn, and I thought I don't want to just be told the things I like to hear. I want to learn everything. And so I was grateful for that. I think it's about how we talk about those things and understanding that if you tell me I'm going to love you, be your friend, regardless if you agree with me or not, then we can talk about everything. But if we coming to a table and saying, unless you convert and believe exactly what I believe, then I don't want to have a relationship with you. You are a conversion project for me. Which, being in a Bible college, that's pretty much how the language sometimes was, is how do you get to the next person? Then that's not a dialogue. That's me coming to tell you what you should do. But other than that, I think it's fantastic to talk about how do you get salvation, what the different groups within each religion talk about that, because within every one of our faiths, there are different groups who have different ideas of how do you get there, how do you interpret the text. I think it's fantastic to talk about it.
I want to say too, I work in cognitive science of religion, and I'm a professor of philosophy, but I would do a lot of work in psychology and cognitive psychology. And I worked a long time on how religious belief arose and how it built groups, how it creates in-group, and how in-group creates out-group. And so then I started looking at religion and violence. And I've come to think, and I think the scientific studies show pretty well, that people don't generally fight over religion. It's not our religious differences that we fight over. What we fight over is food and water. We fight over if our self is attacked. We fight over if our land is taken over. Land is food and water. Here's the easy way to identify somebody. We can identify somebody by their religion. I don't think the conflict in Israel and Palestine has much to do with Judaism and Islam. If you think it's Muslims fighting Jews, then I think you really fundamentally understand what's going on. I don't think ISIS fundamentally cares that much about having everyone be Muslims. I think they feel like, and not wrongly, that there's been injustices that have been done to them, often to their family members. I'll just give an example. Probably at least 500,000 to 1.25 million innocent people have died in Iraq because of our attack. And I know what I would do if some country killed my family. We've dropped bombs on gymnasiums or hospitals full of sick people. Injustices have happened and people want to right injustices. And so an easy way to identify people on either side is Muslim, Christian, but I don't think it really gets at why people actually are violent. And it misleads us to think. And I'll just say one more thing and then I'll stop. What happens when we get misled that way is we think it's their problem. Like it's Muslims. And we forget that we dropped the bombs in the first place, that we contributed to the injustice, and the injustice caused problems, and lack of fresh water, and destroying the infrastructure, all the effects of that. The infant mortality rate skyrocketed in Iraq after the invasion. But when some people in ISIS want to find some way, people without power do suicide bombings. People with power drop massive bombs. People without power have tiny bombs that kill a few people. I don't mean to justify what they do, but they're not irrational, they're not crazy, and they're not motivated by Islam. They're motivated by a sense of injustice. And it's not their problem, it's all of our problem.
I would just like to say, from my perspective, I've been spending a lot of time with campus chaplains lately, because I have a project working on campus chaplaincy for a multi-faith world. And what the campus chaplains tell me is that a panel in which the teams line up to do their debate about their beliefs about salvation or redemption or whatever are really not very interesting to students, because 30 to 40% of the students who show up on campus don't even know which team they're on, because they're coming at this point in time. It used to be when you came to campus, people would sign up, I'm Jewish, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim. They said in many schools, it depends on the school, of course, obviously, but as a generalization, many schools are now seeing as close to 30-40% of the students are signing up as no preference, spiritual, seeker, humanist, not religious. Now, this is what's happening now. So do we start trying to have a debate with them about, well, do you like this belief in the afterlife or that belief in? How about if we talk to people about what they're really interested in right now, which is, how do I cultivate my character so I can live in this world with resilience and with courage and with compassion? In a very fraught time, how can I learn to be able to show up as the kind of person I most want to be? And so I actually don't do theological dialogue at all anymore. I'm mostly interested in dialogue about spiritual practices, sharing the treasure chests of our traditions, each of which traditions have these treasure chests filled with practices. And what are these practices about? They're practices that help people, and we've known for centuries now, help people to build the muscles to be kind, to be patient, to have equanimity. And this is actually the stuff that I think people are interested in learning right now. And we're the ones who know it, we religious folks. So that's my answer to the dialogue of theologies.
Yeah.
I'm sure you all know that right now in this country, for about the last 10 years, we've had a great increase in Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry. We've also had a fairly recent rise in anti-Semitism, and it's a major challenge that our whole country is facing. Have you garnered wisdom from each other about how to respond to that?
Well, I was just telling at dinner that I'm on the board of something called the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, and we have 170 chapters. You're nodding. Do some of you belong to a chapter? Okay, write it down. Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. We have a website. We have 170 chapters all over the country. I said there are 4 in Chicago. I don't know if there's any in this town. I could look on the website. But what I will tell you is that we do have a philosophy, a theory of social change. And it starts with relationship building one-on-one. It starts with one Muslim woman and one Jewish woman sitting together at a meeting and hearing each other's stories about what it meant to go through puberty, or what it meant to get married or not married, or what it, all the things that just learning about what it is to be alive as women. And this organization is just Jewish and Muslim women. We learn from each other. We listen to one another. We do social justice work together, tzedakah projects together. And then we go back to our communities. And when we hear hate, when we hear ignorance, we speak up and we say, that can't be right because I have this friend. And that's the theory. There are many other theories of how to address the problems of our society right now, but that's the one that I'm personally very involved in right now.
I do something similar, not only Jewish Muslim though. I co-started an organization called I'm Your Protector, which what it does is looking for stories of people who are different than us, who protected somebody who's different than them. So we're looking, for example, for Muslims who saved Jews in the Holocaust. And we take the picture of the person, we write their stories, and then we do exhibits about them. We take Jews who saved Muslims in Bosnia, and we do the same kind of exhibits. We take Muslims and Jews here in the United States who've helped save people in different kind of, could be individual situation. We work on all kind of projects like that, and we're doing a lot of exhibits. And the organization is now 4 years old, and we've had exhibits that have reached, I think, about 6 million people so far. Working a lot with universities, with schools, with communities, with the United Nations, with all different groups, and it's fully focused on storytelling and using stories that would shock people. Because when you tell a community about considering everything we hear about Israel and Palestine, when you say a Muslim who saved a Jew in the Holocaust, you'd be amazed how many people are so shocked. Or when you hear about a Jew who saved a Muslim, or we do other communities as well. We do white and black, we do immigrants and non-immigrants, refugees, non-refugees. So we trying to take all the communities that we kind of generalize and say there's a growth of like those people are bad, and we're trying to bring stories that would make people who come to listen to those stories think, okay, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I need to rethink my position.
I work at the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and I don't do it all myself, I do hardly any of it, but we have a team that does lots of things to bring people together across the interfaith divide. And you can get these and take them, they're out there, and I have some up here. This is just the month of October, all sorts of different activities for people to come. I write, and I work with academics. I mostly do international projects. And I think I mentioned this, but I try to bring young Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thought leaders together, professors or graduate students, and I try to get them to bring peace and compassion into their classrooms, into their writing, and back to their communities. And so we usually have an academic project, that's the text, and then we have an interfaith subtext, and we talk about those. And I'll just say one interesting thing that happened. Academics aren't perfect. It's maybe a shock. We had, in this group, we had about 40 Muslim, Christian, and Jewish professors. Some were just super brilliant, high-level physicists that published books that were read by way more than 1.43 people. Just super accomplished, smart people who had all the same biases and prejudices that all the rest of us do. And I told the story that I told about some of my own biases and prejudices that I overcame, and I'm still working to overcome, because we're all human beings and we're all on a journey, and it's all really hard to get rid of these. And if we're not honest about them, we'll never get rid of them. But we had some really serious anti-Semitism in Islamophobia in our group. And I'll give you just two quick examples. Our most conservative Jew who lived in Israel walked up to one of the Muslims and in really good spirit, because this is nearly at the end of a week where we got along really well. We were all getting along really well. So he felt like he could ask this question. He walked up to the Muslim and said, you really want to kill me, don't you? And
Who said that?
and the Muslim who said that responded remarkably. And I'm glad the guy said it. If he felt it, I'm glad he said it.
Yeah.
If we don't say these things, we won't get anywhere. So honestly, I'm glad he said it. And at the very end, we had two really serious anti-Semitic issues that happened, and so we had a meeting on the first night to the first night. We've been meeting once a week for 3 years, and this is the last year. And on the first night of the last year, and I talked to Mike about it, and I talked to 3 or 4 other people, and he even offered to send somebody in who could do this, but nearly everyone said, don't do it. Whatever you do, don't do this. You're just going to ruin your whole week. Don't do it. And I just thought, this is where it's hard, where people say what they really think. And we're going to let people say what they really think. And sadly, the 2 people who made these anti-Semitic comments, one didn't come at all, and one walked out when a Jewish speaker, she walked out and he started speaking. And yet, it was a totally transformative experience for everyone else who stayed. It's really hard to get over biases. It's really hard, and even if you have PhDs, it's still hard. And we did pretty well in 3 years, and we faced these issues head on. And then people kept talking about it all week. So it was a good thing for everyone who stayed, and hopefully in the long run it'll be a good thing for the 2 people who didn't stay. So a lot of you met people here. Get somebody's phone number, go out for coffee. Start this group. Let this be the start of a friendship that you had here. Don't let it be, we talked and we're done, because getting over our prejudices and biases doesn't happen like that. It happens like that, and it takes a long time. I want to read one last passage, and then there is food out there for everybody. I stand on the beach and watch the rushing water seek out all the low places. Its wriggling fingers reach out to find and fill empty space. Its reach exhausted, another wave follows and fills those empty places, and another. There are always more than enough, abundance. I want to extend my arms in grace and mercy to find and fill the world's empty spaces. When compassion and joy fill in the holes, the cracks and crevices, the nooks and crannies and hidden places, peace and harmony overflow with the rightness of the world. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.